Good morning, Cornerstone. One of the words that's become really popular in the last year or two is the word trigger warning or phrase. And that word was explored by an article written in 2019 by The Atlantic. And in that, it describes trigger warnings as something that is being used largely by college professors to warn incoming students about content that is either that is somehow going to potentially remind them of some kind of a trauma they've experienced. Often it's related to things that are sexual in nature, sexually violent in nature, or racist in nature. And trigger warnings are something that are, the purpose of them, the reason that professors use them is to prepare an audience to recognize that they may have to deal with things that are uncomfortable, memories that are challenging, and to employ whatever techniques or methods are best for them in dealing with those difficult memories as they are reminded of them through whatever literature the professor's hoping to look at, whatever art. And in some ways, 1 Peter 3, 1 through 7 could potentially have some negative memories, some negative associations for many Christians, especially women. And the reason for that is because of the misuse of phrases like submit, weaker vessel. 1 Peter 3 explores some ideas around dress and how we adorn ourselves. And then it follows it up with, hey, you need to have a gentle and quiet spirit. And the truth is that many people within the church, this passage has been used by people in the church wrongly. I want to start by apologizing for that and recognizing that. But as I read that article in The Atlantic, what I also recognized was that the article explores the reality that most of the studies that have explored the use of trigger warnings by professors have found that it doesn't actually help. And so it's good for us to just go ahead and recognize that this could be a challenging passage, but the truth is, just by recognizing it, it's not going to make it any easier for those of you who've been hurt. For those of you who may find this passage to be to poke or prod at old wounds. So I want to start out by with that apology by saying I'm sorry that it's been abused. And I also want to start out by saying this. If in the course of this little micro sermon that I give today, I say something, I misspeak, or I say something that feels unkind, or more importantly, if it feels unbiblical, I want you to reach out and say, John, let's talk about this. I want you to go back to the Bible and recognize I can trust this book. I can trust that the author of this book, the intent of this book is good and lovely and right. So that we don't perpetuate this cycle of misappropriating the word to reinforce our own cultural expectations. Having said that, the Bible is a book that explores the good, the bad, and the ugly. And if you look at the history between male and female relationships, men and women, husbands and wives, which this passage specifically does today, we can go all the way back to just the first couple of chapters of Genesis and look in Genesis 3:16, where it says part of the curse for the woman is that she shall desire her husband, she shall want her husband, she shall be against her husband, depending on your translation. Her desire will be for her husband, and he will be lord over her. He will rule over her. And if we look around society, we see that is historically true, that men predominantly are in charge. Now, I want to suggest that the Bible isn't, it's just calling it like it is. And some people will look at that and some people will tell you, look, the Bible's all about patriarchy and chauvinism and it's all about, oppression. And I would say that the Bible's realistic. some of those people who politically, who want to take a political correct attitude and kind of force the Bible into it and say, look, the Bible is not fitting with what we would expect to be culturally norm, also are the same people who in Hollywood don't recognize that there is a huge wage discrepancy between actors and actresses. In fact, one study I read this week suggests that among the upper echelon of Hollywood actors and actresses, the ones that aren't, on like, your fill-in actors and actresses, people that we might know, there's actually, women are paid almost 40% less than men. See, Genesis gets it. The Bible gets it. This is just the way the world is. Doesn't make it right. It is part of the curse. It is part of the fall. That in our broken state, in our broken nature, because of sin entering the world, we get it wrong. And today in 1 Peter, and if you haven't read it, I would suggest you go ahead and read the first 7 verses. Go pause, and read those first 7 verses. Peter says, he finishes this series of 3 be subjects. First, he said, be subject to human institutions. And even if the people in those human institutions are foolish and ignorant, by your good deeds, you will bring about the good news of Jesus. And secondly, if be subject to earthly masters, even if they're unjust or cruel, because by your good deeds, you will show them the way of Jesus. And this is the third of this succession of ideas, and it's addressing specifically wives and husbands. And I want to point this out, that this is specific to wives and husbands, not women and men. Women are not called to be subject to men. Wives are being called to be subject to husbands. And again, it's a situation where the husbands are imperfect. These aren't great husbands. And the way Peter suggests that good is brought about this is through conduct, this attitude of being subject, which the church has been called to do towards human institutions, which slaves or servants have been called to do towards earthly masters, that wives are called to be subject to their husbands through their conduct. And it's in this succession, in this idea of being subject in imperfect situations, that God will work. Now, there's lots of good stuff out there about that conduct and what that looks like. The words that 1 Peter uses are words like respect. And there's good work done by Dr. Edgerich on his book, Love and Respect. You can use that resource. Some of the language that's used in here is to have a quiet and gentle spirit. And some people transliterate that into a way that is almost oppressive, like women have to be quiet. Your personality, your demeanor has to be, you should be silent in church. You should be silent around your husband, completely silent. And I think I read a scholar this week who said something more like, the attitude there is that you don't have a cantankerous spirit or a cantankerous grumbling. That's the language he used. That there isn't a kind of this nitpicky, backbiting kind of attitude, but that the conduct of wives is what will redeem their husbands more than their words. Imperfect husbands, let me point this out. The second thing that we see in this passage of 1 Peter 3 is that there's an emphasis on dress. There's an emphasis on adornment. And that the dress, the external dress, is actually not the primary thing. The passage, if we read it here in context, the passage reads this: do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair, the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing that you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. Now, the focus here, sometimes this, again, in the past, people have used this to kind of form a dress code. And by so doing, they've actually done exactly what Peter doesn't want to make the primary thing, which is external dress. The Bible is real. The Bible recognizes, hey, women in the first century put a big emphasis on dress. They used dress to command influence. They used their adornment to command influence. And it would be inappropriate for the church to look at that and say, oh, here's a guideline. Here's the way that we should dress. That's not what Peter's doing. Peter's saying take the focus off of the external and put it onto the internal. And so sometimes churches, when they get real hung up on the length of your skirt, whether you have a nose ring, whether you have a tattoo, they've done exactly the thing Peter's saying don't do, which is put emphasis on the external. Rather, Peter says, put emphasis on the internal, on your conduct. And the way you do that is this really interesting illustration. He says the way you do that is you follow the example of Sarah. Now, Sarah's an interesting person. Let's pick this up in verse 5. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. The story of Sarah and Abraham is a super complicated story, but let me point out just a few quick things. First of all, Abram is a patriarch, and he's not a good husband. Abram in Genesis 12 tries to uses his wife's, he leverages his wife's beauty and says, she's my sister, to get essentially status when they go to Egypt during a famine. And in that famine, in that time, Pharaoh gets wind that this guy's got a good looking sister and actually takes her from Abraham. Later on, Sarah and Abraham, they have an imperfect relationship. She is barren, and she suggests to Abraham, hey, let's take my servant. Her name's Hagar. She's actually from Egypt. So the sin that happened earlier is coming back to rest potentially in this relationship. And Sarah says, take my servant and have a child with her so that my barrenness may be fulfilled through my servant. And Abraham goes along with it. It's a broken, messed up situation. And so you have to wonder what in the world is going on. Why would Peter use this as the example? And I think it's two things. One, he uses this as an example because it's a real example. It's the good, the bad, and the ugly. Like, this is real relationship. Abraham, the patriarch, is broken. Sarah is a broken person. And yet through all of this, she maintains a sense of respect. She actually continues to call Abraham, in spite of his imperfections, she has a term of respect. My Lord is the word that she uses. And Peter latches onto that and he says, that attitude of respect, that conduct is the way that we are to adorn ourselves internally with a sense of respect. Abraham, an imperfect husband, is won by Sarah's internal adornment. And she was probably a pretty good looking lady. And yet what the Bible commends her for is her maintaining her sense of respect towards her husband. Now, the last verse is, in some ways, the one that gets the least attention, and I think maybe the most important, and it's the one that's addressed to the husbands. And not most important because it's to the men, but most important because it gives the best example of what the opportunity is for the church to model healthy relationships. And it says this in verse 7, likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the women as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you, or co-heirs might be the way to read that, of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Now, there's a lot to unpack, and I'm going to try to do this in a minute and a half. Here we go. Weaker vessel. I think weaker vessel simply means is a recognition that culturally in the first century, and still even today, we can recognize that women are physically less strong than men. It just is a reality. And then secondly, socially, they have less pull or less influence. And that was even more true in the first century, but it's still true in the 21st century. And that we as husbands are not to use that as a way of lording over our wives. Rather, we're to look at them as co-heirs. Co-heirs suggests, hey, we get an equal portion of what is what is coming through God's grace, what is coming through God's kingdom. I'm not higher than you are. We are co-heirs. We aren't to use our strength to our advantage. The other piece of this that's really interesting is that word likewise. And I believe that that word likewise, both in verse 1 and in verse 7, ties together the wives and the husbands to Jesus. The model that the husband is called to is not to be like Abraham, but he is to be like Christ. And the woman is to submit to her husband because of the example of Christ. And that is, we see that in chapter 2, verses 21 through 25, where it says this: "For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither did he lie. And when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on a tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you've been healed. For you were straying like sheep, but you have now returned to the shepherd and the overseer of your souls." Husbands, we are called. Wives, we are called in this marriage relationship to model the redemptive plan for human relationships by dying to ourselves like Christ and seeing each other as co-heirs. Men, we are called, the word here is to live in understanding. Oscar Wilde said that women are to be loved but cannot be understood. And that is exactly wrong. That is exactly not what Peter's saying. He's saying we are to live in understanding with our wife. The privilege that we have as husbands is to understand the person that God has entrusted us with. Not in a way of lording it over her, but in a way of saying, hey, what's important to you is important to me. I believe that this section on submission, being subject, finishes with this image of a healthy marriage. It finishes in verse 7 by saying, it